I never imagined that my chickens would land me in the middle of a police incident. But when Margaret, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, decided to call the cops, things took a turn she never saw coming. I had moved to this quiet countryside community to escape the chaos of city life. No traffic noise, no nosy landlords, just wide-open spaces, fresh air, and my dream of raising a few farm animals. I wasn't running a full-scale farm, just a handful of chickens for eggs, a couple of goats for milk, and my loyal dog, Max, who spent most of his days lounging on the porch. Life was peaceful until Margaret entered the picture. Margaret, my next-door neighbor, was the self-appointed ruler of our little community. Despite the fact that our neighborhood didn't have a homeowners association, HOA, she acted as if she ran one. From the moment I moved in, she made it her mission to impose her imaginary rules on everyone. At first, it was small things, passive-aggressive comments about my unkempt lawn, complaints about my choice of mailbox, and unsolicited advice about proper community standards. I ignored her, but when she turned her attention to my animals, that's when the trouble began. It started with notes slipped under my door, taped to my fence, and even stuffed in my mailbox. Livestock is not allowed in a residential neighborhood, one note read. Your chickens are a health hazard, another claimed. Your goats are lowering property values. At first, I laughed them off. The county zoning laws clearly allowed small farm animals, and there was no HOA to enforce any restrictions. But Margaret wasn't one to back down. When I refused to get rid of my animals, she escalated. One morning, I stepped outside to find her standing at my property line, arms crossed, a scowl on her face. You need to remove those animals, she declared. I sighed. Margaret, there's no rule against having them. This isn't an HOA neighborhood. She huffed. I represent the neighborhood committee, and we have standards. There is no committee, I said, barely able to keep a straight face. Well, we're forming one, she snapped, and you'll have to comply with our regulations. I turned and walked away, refusing to waste any more energy on her nonsense. But I should have known Margaret wasn't going to let it go. A few days later, I heard shouting outside. I peeked through my window and saw Margaret standing at my fence, yelling into her phone. It wasn't until I stepped outside that I realized she was talking to the police. Yes, I need an officer immediately. There are wild animals running loose. It's a disaster waiting to happen. I shook my head, chuckling. Margaret, my animals are in a fenced area. They're not running loose. She ignored me, speaking louder into the phone. There are large, aggressive animals endangering the neighborhood. I looked over at my aggressive animals. The goats were lazily chewing on grass, the chickens clucked peacefully in their coop, and Max, my dog, rolled onto his back, enjoying the sun. Margaret, you're wasting the cops' time, I said. She shot me a smug look. We'll see about that. 10 minutes later, 2 police officers pulled up. I watched as Margaret rushed toward them, dramatically waving her arms as if she had just witnessed a crime scene. Thank God you're here, she exclaimed. This man is keeping wild livestock in a residential area. His animals are dangerous. They've been terrorizing the neighborhood. I stepped forward, arms crossed. That's a complete lie. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a skeptical expression, turned to me. Sir, are you keeping farm animals here? Yes, I replied. And they're perfectly legal. This isn't an HOA, and there are no restrictions against livestock. Margaret gasped. You're just going to take his word for it? Look around chickens, goats. It's a nightmare. The second officer, a younger guy, scratched his head. Ma'am, having farm animals isn't a crime. Margaret's face turned red. It should be. They're bringing down property values. That's not a police matter, the older officer said, already looking like he regretted responding to this call. I sighed, walking toward my mailbox and pulling out a copy of the county zoning laws. Here, according to local regulations, I'm allowed to have small livestock as long as they're properly contained, which they are. The officer skimmed the document and nodded. Yep, looks like everything is in order. Margaret looked like she was about to explode. This is outrageous. You're supposed to be upholding the law. The officer crossed his arms. Ma'am, no laws are being broken here. Margaret's jaw dropped. What about noise complaints? The animals are constantly making a racket. The younger officer glanced at the animals, who were mostly silent except for a lone chicken clucking softly. Doesn't seem too noisy to me. Margaret was livid. So you're just going to let him get away with this? Ma'am, the officer said, unless you have an actual legal complaint, we're done here. Margaret wasn't having it. No, he's ruining the neighborhood. If the police won't do something, then I will. And that's when she made the worst mistake of her life. Before anyone could react, Margaret stormed past the officers and stomped right onto my property. You want to keep these filthy animals? Fine, I'll handle it myself. She kicked over a bucket of feed, sending grain flying everywhere. The goats scattered in surprise, and Max barked, jumping up from his nap. I held up my hands. Margaret, you just stepped onto my property. That's trespassing. She scoffed. So what? I'm just helping clean up this mess. The older officer stepped forward, reaching for his radio. Ma'am, you need to leave the property immediately. Margaret rolled her eyes. Oh, please. What are you going to do? Arrest me for caring about my community? The officer's expression hardened. Actually, yes. Margaret froze. Wait, what? Before she could react, the officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. You're under arrest for trespassing and destruction of property. Her eyes widened. You can't be serious. The younger officer nodded. Afraid we are, ma'am. Margaret screamed as they cuffed her. This is an injustice. I am the victim here. She turned to me, her face contorted with rage. You set me up. I smirked. No, Margaret. You set yourself up. The officers led her to the patrol car, and as she was shoved into the back seat, she screeched, This isn't over. You'll regret this. I waved cheerfully. Have a nice day, Margaret. As the police car pulled away, Max sat beside me, wagging his tail as if he knew justice had been served. I scratched his head and glanced at my goats, who had already resumed their peaceful grazing. Finally, peace had returned to my farm. But something told me that Margaret's saga wasn't over just yet. The police car had barely left my driveway when I noticed a few of my neighbors gathering near their fences, whispering amongst themselves. Some of them had been victims of Margaret's antics before, and they were clearly enjoying the spectacle. A few even gave me an approving nod. But while I hoped this was the end of it, I knew Margaret well enough to suspect otherwise. Sure enough, less than an hour later, I got a phone call from an unknown number. When I answered, a smug and all too familiar voice came through the line. You've made a big mistake, Margaret sneered. I have connections in this town, and you're going to regret humiliating me like that. I sighed. Margaret, you trespassed on my property. You literally got yourself arrested. She ignored me. The cops may have overreacted, but don't worry, my lawyer will have this thrown out in no time. And when that happens, you better believe I'll be coming after you. Coming after me? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Are you seriously threatening me right now? It's not a threat, she snapped. It's a promise. I hung up, shaking my head. Margaret had just been arrested, and instead of learning her lesson, she was doubling down. The next morning, I was surprised to see another police car pulling up to my driveway. I stepped outside, expecting to see the same officers from yesterday, but instead, a different officer, a woman with a sharp gaze, exited the vehicle. Mr. Daniels? She asked, clipboard in hand. That's me, I said cautiously. What's this about? She glanced around my property. We received a report this morning about illegal animal activity and sanitation concerns. It was reported that you were keeping animals in unsanitary conditions and that they may be spreading disease. I blinked. You're joking. The officer shook her head. I assure you, sir, I'm not. I let out a sigh. Let me guess. The report came from a woman named Margaret. Her lips twitched slightly, as if she was holding back a smirk. I can't disclose the complainant's name, but let's just say you wouldn't be wrong. I pinched the bridge of my nose. You're welcome to inspect my property, officer, but I can assure you everything is clean, and my animals are well cared for. She nodded. Let's take a look. I led her through my small farm setup, pointing out the freshly cleaned chicken coop, the goat pen, and the designated waste disposal area. Everything was tidy, the animals were well fed, and there was no sign of anything remotely unsanitary. After jotting down a few notes, the officer finally turned to me. Everything looks good. In fact, I've seen far worse conditions at professional farms. I'll be closing the complaint. I exhaled in relief. Thanks, officer. I appreciate you coming out, even though this was clearly a waste of time. She chuckled. Not the first time we've had a complaint from this particular individual. That confirmed it. So, what happens now? Well, she said, tucking her clipboard under her arm. Since this is the second time in 2 days that a baseless complaint has been made against you, I'd suggest keeping records of everything. If she keeps this up, you might have grounds to file harassment charges. That gave me an idea. Would I also be able to file for a restraining order? She nodded. It's possible, especially considering the trespassing charge. You should speak with a lawyer. As she drove off, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Margaret thought she could bully me with false reports, but all she was doing was building a legal case against herself. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from one of my neighbors, Tom. He sent me a screenshot of a post from the local neighborhood forum. Attention, community. We cannot allow livestock to destroy the integrity of our neighborhood. The authorities have been made aware of this disgusting situation, but we must stand together to protect our property values. Let's show these wannabe farmers that this is not acceptable. Margaret. I groaned. It was one thing for Margaret to call the cops on me, but now she was trying to rally the neighborhood against me. A few hours later, a new post appeared beneath hers. Margaret, the only thing ruining the neighborhood is you. Tom. Yeah, leave the guy alone. His farm is fine. The only thing spreading disease is your bad attitude. Lisa. If you hate animals so much, why did you move to the countryside? Sam. I couldn't help but laugh. It seemed Margaret's plan had completely backfired. Instead of turning the neighborhood against me, she had just exposed herself as a troublemaker. But Margaret wasn't done yet. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of loud knocking at my door. When I opened it, I was met with a man in an ill-fitting suit, holding a thick stack of papers. Are you Mr. Daniels? He asked. Yeah. And you are? I'm representing Miss Margaret Thompson, he said, adjusting his tie. She's filed a cease and desist order against you. I blinked. What? He handed me the papers. Miss Thompson is demanding that you remove all livestock from your property immediately. She claims they are a violation of neighborhood standards. I skimmed through the document and burst out laughing. This isn't even legally enforceable. There's no HOA. The lawyer cleared his throat. Miss Thompson is prepared to escalate this to civil court if necessary. I shook my head. Tell Margaret to save her money. She's going to lose. He looked uncomfortable. Between you and me, sir, I strongly advised her against this, but she insisted. That made me laugh even harder. Well, good luck with that. As he walked away, I realized something. Margaret was completely spiraling. She had tried calling the cops. She had tried turning the neighborhood against me. And now she was wasting money on legal threats that had no foundation. I had a feeling this was going to end very badly for her. The moment Margaret's lawyer left my property, I knew things were about to escalate. Margaret had already called the cops on me twice, filed false complaints, and now she was trying to take me to court over farm animals that were perfectly legal. But if there was one thing I knew about people like her, it was that they never stopped until they pushed things too far. And Margaret, she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Later that afternoon, I was finishing up some work on my property when I heard a commotion near my fence. Max, my old but sharp-eared dog, was already on alert, his tail stiff as he growled toward the front of the house. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked toward the noise. That's when I saw her. Margaret stood at the edge of my property, red-faced and fuming. But she wasn't alone. She had brought a couple of her so-called neighborhood committee members, really just two older women who looked more uncomfortable than anything. One of them whispered something to the other, clearly having second thoughts about whatever nonsense Margaret had dragged them into. I leaned against the fence. Margaret, what are you doing now? She crossed her arms. You were served a legal notice. I expect those filthy animals to be gone by the end of the day. I scoffed. You mean the fake cease and desist letter your lawyer admitted was pointless? Yeah, not happening. Margaret's face twitched. This isn't over. It really is, I said. But welcome to keep wasting your time. That was all it took. Something in her snapped. Without warning, Margaret shoved the fence gate open and stormed onto my property. Margaret, that's trespassing, I warned. She ignored me, marching straight toward the chicken coop. If you won't remove them, I will. My heart skipped a beat. Was she really about to mess with my animals? Before I could react, Margaret reached the chicken coop and kicked the door open. The hens squawked in alarm, flapping their wings wildly as they scattered. A few of them bolted out of the coop and onto the yard. What the hell is wrong with you? I shouted, rushing toward her. She whirled around with a smug grin. just doing what's necessary. But she wasn't done. With a gleam of self-righteous fury, she turned toward my goat pen. I could see her setting her sights on the gate latch. "If you touch that, Margaret, I swear. Too late." She grabbed the latch and pulled. The gate swung open. Now, I don't know if Margaret thought the goats were going to politely walk out and thank her for their freedom, but if she had ever spent even 1 second around farm animals, she would have known what was coming. My 2 goats, Buddy and Bella, charged. Margaret barely had time to react before 150 pounds of angry, panicked goat barreled straight into her. She screamed as Bella slammed into her legs, knocking her off balance. Buddy, being the mischievous troublemaker he was, took the opportunity to leap onto Margaret's back. I swear, I've never seen anything funnier in my life. Margaret shrieked like a banshee, flailing wildly as she tried to get the goat off her back. But Buddy wasn't moving. He had decided that Margaret was now his personal playground, and he was having the time of his life. Meanwhile, Bella, spooked by all the commotion, started bucking wildly. One of Margaret's committee members screamed and took off running. The other just stood there, frozen in shock. I doubled over laughing. "Oh my God, Margaret, do you need some help?" "Get them off me," she screeched. I took out my phone and hit record. "Say please." She threw me a murderous glare. "You're dead. Do you hear me? Dead." At that moment, Max, who had been watching everything unfold with clear amusement, decided to join in. He trotted over, tail wagging, and started barking happily, probably thinking this was some kind of new game. That's when the police arrived. 2 officers, one of them the same guy from yesterday, stepped out of their patrol car, taking in the scene with open disbelief. Margaret flailing under a goat, me recording with a massive grin, chickens running loose everywhere, one neighbor hiding behind a tree, and another neighbor watching like this was the best entertainment they'd seen in years. The older officer let out a long sigh. "I don't even want to ask." The younger officer stifled a laugh. "But I think we have to." Margaret, realizing the cops were here, started screeching. "Arrest him. He's a menace. His animals attacked me." But the officers weren't buying it. The older one raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, why are you on his property?" Margaret hesitated. I was handling a neighborhood issue by breaking into his goat pen," she floundered. "It's my right as a citizen to uphold community standards." The younger cop blinked. "That's not how the law works." I smirked. "She kicked open my chicken coop and let my goats loose. She's trespassing and destroying property." The older officer turned to me. "Do you want to press charges?" Margaret paled. "You can't be serious." I pretended to think about it, rubbing my chin. "Let's see, you broke onto my property, messed with my animals, and just yesterday you were arrested for trespassing. What do you think, officer?" The older cop pulled out his handcuffs. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for trespassing, destruction of property, and animal endangerment." Margaret lost it. "No, you can't do this to me again." The younger officer looked at me. "You want to get your goat off her back?" I waved him off. "Nah, let him enjoy the moment." Eventually, they managed to wrangle Buddy off Margaret and drag her, screaming, kicking, and threatening lawsuits, to the patrol car. As they shoved her inside, she slammed her hands against the window. "I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you." The officers ignored her. The younger one turned to me. "We're recommending a restraining order. Might be best for your sanity." I grinned. I was thinking the same thing. As the patrol car pulled away, the neighbors burst into laughter. Even the officer chuckled. Tom, my closest neighbor, patted my shoulder. "Dude, I think your goats just did what we've all been dreaming of." I glanced at Buddy, who stood proudly like a victorious knight. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "Best farm animals ever." With Margaret gone for now, I turned to my animals, clapped my hands, and called them back. The chickens returned to their coop, the goats happily trotted back into their pen, and Max plopped down at my feet, tail wagging. Peace at last, at least until Margaret found a way to cause more chaos. But that was a problem for another day. The moment Margaret's patrol car disappeared down the road, the entire neighborhood erupted in laughter. People had come out of their homes, standing on porches, peeking over fences, and gathering in small groups to whisper about what had just happened. Tom wiped a tear from his eye, still chuckling. "Man, I swear I've lived here for 15 years, and that was the best thing I've ever seen." Lisa, another neighbor, shook her head. She really thought she could boss everyone around. Huh? She always thinks she's in charge, Tom muttered, glad someone finally put her in her place. I smirked. Technically, Buddy did. The group chuckled again, and I turned to head back inside, hoping that this would be the last of Margaret's nonsense. But knowing her, I highly doubted it. Less than an hour later, I received a call from an unknown number. I picked up, already suspecting who it was. "You humiliated me, you freak." I held the phone away from my ear as Margaret's shrieking voice blasted through the speaker. "Margaret, you're in jail. How are you even calling me? They let me use the phone, obviously. And I'm demanding that you retract your statement and tell the police you lied." I laughed. "Margaret, there are about 20 witnesses, not to mention security camera footage. You really think I can just take it back?" Her voice turned venomous. "I'm going to ruin you. You think this is over? I have connections. I will sue. I will." I hung up. No way was I letting her waste more of my time. The next morning, the true extent of Margaret's public humiliation hit full force. A viral post popped up in the neighborhood Facebook group titled "Margaret the Goat Queen," a cautionary tale, and featured a blurry mid-action photo of her being tackled by my goat, Buddy. The comments were gold. "Justice has never been so poetic. Imagine trying to fight a goat and losing. This is better than reality TV. Petition to put Buddy on the neighborhood watch team." And my personal favorite, "No HOA, no problem. Goat reinforced security." The video itself was even funnier. One of the neighbors had recorded the whole thing, from Margaret kicking open the chicken coop to Buddy making her his personal jungle gym. Within hours, the video had thousands of shares. People from other neighborhoods were commenting, laughing about how Margaret got exactly what she deserved. Margaret, of course, was absolutely losing it. Her husband, poor guy, showed up at my doorstep later that afternoon. The man looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Listen," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know my wife can be difficult, but is there any way we can just make this all go away?" I crossed my arms. She broke into my property twice. She destroyed my stuff. She got herself arrested. What exactly am I supposed to make go away? He winced. "She's been screaming about lawsuits and defamation all morning. She's talking about suing the entire neighborhood." I laughed. "Good luck with that." He sighed again. "Look, I'll be honest with you. She's already been fined for trespassing, and after reviewing everything, the cops are pushing for a restraining order. If that happens, she won't be allowed within 50 feet of your property." I raised an eyebrow. "And you want me to stop that from happening?" "No," he muttered, rubbing his face. "Honestly, I'd be relieved. It might finally get her to calm down." I stared at him for a moment. "Man, why are you still with her?" He let out a long-suffering sigh. That's a question I ask myself every day. 2 days later, the court officially granted my restraining order. Margaret was livid. She stormed onto the neighborhood Facebook page, using her husband's account since hers had been suspended for harassment, and started ranting about how the system is corrupt and this is oppression, and that goat was trained to attack me. That last one had people crying with laughter. She really thinks he trained a goat for self-defense? Coming soon. Goat Kung Fu classes. Why is she making Buddy sound like an assassin? Meanwhile, I was enjoying my peaceful, Karen-free farm life. Max lounged in the sun. The chickens were safe and happy, and the goats, absolute legends. But Margaret wasn't finished yet. A week later, I received a formally-looking letter in the mail. It was a lawsuit. Apparently, Margaret had filed a defamation claim against me, claiming emotional distress, damage to her reputation, and financial losses. I burst out laughing. The financial losses she was referring to? That was because her husband had finally filed for divorce. Turns out, the restraining order was the final straw for him. He had packed his bags, filed the paperwork, and was leaving her behind. With no one left to fund her ridiculous antics, Margaret had no choice but to sell her house and move out of the neighborhood. The lawsuit got thrown out immediately. The judge took one look at the viral video, read the police reports, and dismissed it on the spot. And just like that, Margaret was gone. The neighborhood celebrated her departure. Tom even threw a Karen-free cookout in my honor. Lisa showed up with a cake that had Goat 1, Margaret 0 written in frosting. People cheered, we all laughed, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood was peaceful again. As I sat back, watching Buddy and Bella munch on some grass, I couldn't help but smile. Because in the end, the real neighborhood watch was my farm animals all along. With Margaret finally gone, the neighborhood felt like a weight had been lifted. The air seemed fresher, the birds chirped louder, and for the first time in ages, there were no passive-aggressive notes mysteriously appearing on people's doors. It was glorious. But Margaret's downfall wasn't just about her moving away. It was about the absolute destruction of everything she had built, and trust me, it was sweet revenge. The first sign of her crumbling empire came in the form of a legal notice from the county. Apparently, after her second arrest and the restraining order against her, the county decided to do an audit on her so-called neighborhood committee. Turns out, it was a complete fraud. Margaret had been illegally collecting money from residents, claiming it was for neighborhood improvements. In reality, she had been using it for her own personal expenses, including spa trips, new furniture, and an expensive subscription to some online wine club. The county ordered her to repay every cent, and since her husband had left her and taken his money with him, she had no choice but to sell her house just to cover the debt. As soon as her house went on the market, the neighborhood threw a block party to celebrate. Tom set up a grill station, Lisa brought cupcakes decorated with mini goats, and someone even played the viral video of Margaret being tackled by Buddy on a loop via a projector. I stood near the food table, sipping a drink, when Tom nudged me. "Hey, you're going to love this." I turned to see a couple standing in front of Margaret's for sale sign. They looked to be in their early 30s, dressed casually, with a golden retriever happily wagging its tail at their feet. I approached them with a friendly nod. "Thinking of buying the place?" The man grinned. "Yeah, we love the area. It's so peaceful out here." Lisa, overhearing the conversation, nearly choked on her drink from laughing. "Oh, it definitely is now." The woman smiled. "We're actually moving from the city. We wanted more space for our dog and, well, some backyard chickens." I nearly lost it. Tom actually spit out his drink. Lisa had to turn away to hide her hysterical laughter. Margaret's house, the same house from which she had launched her anti-animal crusade, was about to be occupied by people who wanted to raise chickens. It was too perfect. I grinned. "I think you two will fit in just fine." They ended up buying the house, and within weeks, they had a full chicken coop set up in the backyard. Meanwhile, Margaret, she tried moving into a fancy HOA community on the other side of town, thinking she could start fresh. It didn't last a month. One of my old friends who lived in that area sent me a screenshot of a local HOA Facebook page where Margaret had immediately started trouble. She had demanded that people follow proper standards, complained about kids playing outside too loudly, and even argued with the HOA president about shrub height requirements. The best part? She got kicked out. Apparently, her reputation had preceded her, and after she picked a fight with the wrong people, the actual HOA told her to leave the community. She was forced to move into a tiny rental apartment with no say over anything, no petty power, no fake authority, no farm animals to terrorize. Just her, alone in a tiny space, with no control over anyone but herself. It was poetic. And just when I thought it couldn't get any better, the video of her being tackled by Buddy went viral again. A news station picked it up, featuring it in a segment about entitled people getting instant karma. A popular meme page made a compilation of Goats of Justice, highlighting Margaret's downfall as the grand finale. Even people outside our town started recognizing her. One of the neighbors who worked at a grocery store told me that Margaret came in one day and someone recognized her from the video. They walked up to her and said, "Hey, aren't you that lady who got tackled by a goat?" Margaret stormed out of the store in rage. Meanwhile, I was living my best life. My farm was peaceful, the chickens were thriving, the goats were local heroes, and best of all, Margaret was finally gone. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch with Max lying lazily beside me, Tom walked up, holding a beer. He sat down next to me, shaking his head. "Man, I still can't believe how all of this played out." I chuckled. "Yeah, I guess karma really does have a sense of humor." He raised his drink to Buddy, the real MVP. I clinked my bottle against his. To Buddy. At that moment, Buddy, who had been chilling near the fence, let out a triumphant bleat, as if he knew we were talking about him. And just like that, I knew Margaret was never coming back. And life had never been better. With Margaret gone for good, the neighborhood truly felt like it had finally reclaimed its peace. There were no more ridiculous complaints, no more fake violation notices, and no one was constantly trying to enforce imaginary rules. Life was finally back to normal. Well, almost. A few weeks after the chaos had settled, I was tending to my garden when I heard a knock at my front door. I opened it, half expecting some leftover nonsense from Margaret to somehow rear its ugly head again. But instead, standing on my porch was a young man in his early 20s, looking a little nervous. "Ah, hi," he said. "I saw your post about selling fresh eggs. You still got some?" I blinked. "Yeah, hold on." I grabbed a dozen fresh eggs from my fridge and handed them over. "That'll be $5. He handed me the cash and grinned. "Thanks, man. I've been trying to buy fresh eggs for months, but that crazy lady who lived next door kept telling me livestock was illegal." I burst out laughing. "Yeah, well, she's not around anymore." "I noticed," he said, smirking. "Good riddance." And just like that, I accidentally started a small egg-selling business. At first, it was just one or two neighbors stopping by for farm-fresh eggs, but word spread fast, and soon I had a full-blown waiting list. People were lining up on weekends to buy eggs, fresh goat milk, and even some homemade cheese that Lisa helped me make. Tom, never one to pass up an opportunity, even suggested making a small stand at the front of my property. "Turn Margaret's nightmare into a community highlight," he said with a grin. So we did. We built a small farm stand, put up a sign that read, "Goat Free Range Eggs." Margaret would hate this. And let me tell you, it was a hit. Every Saturday morning, people would swing by, grabbing eggs, fresh produce, and sometimes just to chat about how peaceful things had become since the tyrant of the cul-de-sac was dethroned. It was hilarious watching Margaret's old house, now occupied by a couple who absolutely loved their backyard chickens, become one of my best customers. But the true icing on the cake? The local news station did a short segment on our little farm stand. The reporter, clearly enjoying the irony, even referenced the viral goat video and titled the piece "From Chaos to Community: How One Farm Animal Helped Restore Peace." I still couldn't believe it. My farm animals had become local legends. Max, the dog, the town's best greeter. The chickens, now Instagram famous. Buddy, the goat, a living meme. And me, well, I was just a guy enjoying the quiet life and selling a ridiculous amount of eggs. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Tom and Lisa joined me, drinks in hand. Tom chuckled. "So, what do you think, man? You moved out here for peace and quiet, and now you're running a whole operation." I shook my head with a grin. "Yeah, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Lisa laughed. "It's crazy how everything worked out. Margaret tried so hard to control this neighborhood, and now she's just a bad memory. More like an internet punchline," Tom added, smirking. "Seriously, have you seen the latest meme?" I pulled out my phone and checked my messages. Sure enough, someone had edited a picture of Buddy standing on Margaret's back with the caption, "When HOA power trips go wrong." I lost it. Tom grinned. "Dude, you should frame that." I was tempted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I leaned back in my chair, Max curled up at my feet, and felt genuinely content. Margaret was gone. The neighborhood was thriving, and I had everything I wanted: a peaceful home, a small farm, and a community that actually looked out for each other. And the best part? Margaret never saw it coming. So what do you think? Was justice served? Would you have handled things differently? Have you ever dealt with a Margaret-like character before? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your best HOA horror stories, revenge tales, or just your favorite part of this wild ride. And hey, if you enjoyed watching Margaret get exactly what she deserved, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more crazy HOA stories, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a wild update. Because if there's one thing we've learned, it's that HOA Margarets never stop, and trust me, there's always another one waiting to strike. So stick around, you won't want to miss what happens next.